If you imagine medieval battles as polite sword fights between shiny knights quoting poetry at each other, I have some bad news for you. Those fields were not won by chivalry or elegant blade work. They were won by brutal problem solving. Every serious army relied on weapons designed with one purpose in mind: find the weak spot in whatever the enemy thought would keep them alive and smash straight through it. Behind all the banners, trumpets, and heroic speeches stood a quieter kind of genius. Weaponsmiths. People who spent their lives turning human fear into iron and steel. Knights brought courage, training, and expensive armor. Weaponsmiths brought the bad news that none of that made you truly safe. And nothing delivers that message quite like the warhammer. Forget the image of a smith lovingly crafting a shining sword for a noble hero. Picture instead a craftsman staring at a fully armored knight and thinking, all right, how do we turn that walking metal tank into a crumpled drinks can? For a long time, wealthy knights truly believed they had solved the not dying problem. Plate armor was the medieval luxury car of protection. It was incredibly expensive, often custom fitted, and it actually worked. A well-made suit could shrug off sword cuts, glance arrows away, and make most peasant weapons feel like angry taps on a cooking pot. If you were a rich knight, you were basically investing in wearable confidence. You trained for years in swordplay and mounted combat. You paid a fortune for armor, and you rode into battle thinking, I am the main character. Then the warhammer showed up and turned that main character energy into a very short story. Because here is the unpleasant truth: swords are terrible at dealing with solid plate armor. A sword edge wants soft things. Flesh, leather, maybe mail if you get lucky. But against hardened steel plates that curve and deflect your beautiful blade, mostly just skids away. A warhammer does not skid. Instead of trying to cut it, focuses all its power into a tiny area. Take a relatively small hammer face, put it on the end of a sturdy shaft, and swing it with all your weight. The force arrives in a tight, violent burst. The metal of the armor might not even break. The skull under the helmet, however, has a very different experience. The physics here is simple and nasty. Energy has to go somewhere. The warhammer is built to make sure it goes straight through the armor and into the person inside. So while a sword might ring cheerfully off a helmet, a hammer just slams that metal inward, crushing bone and rattling brain. You do not need to pierce the armor if you can turn the wearer's insides into jelly. Knights thought they were wrapping themselves in medieval tank armor. In reality, they were stepping into a very expensive, very portable steel drum, and the warhammer was the drumstick.
A lot of warhammers were even more flexible than they first appeared.
Many came with a flat or slightly curved hammerhead on one side and a vicious spike on the other.
One tool, two jobs.
Need to crush through a helmet or batter someone to the ground, use the hammer side. Need to punch through a stubborn breastplate or hook someone out of the saddle, flip to the spike. If your enemy looks like a walking, can you bring the ultimate medieval can opener? On the battlefield, this mattered a lot. A knight might survive sword strikes all day as the armor spread out the impact. But when a hammer slammed into that same plate, the force traveled through the metal like a shock wave. Ribs cracked. Collarbones snapped. Skulls caved in without a single hole in the helmet. The horror was not just the death. It was how silent and invisible the damage could be until the knight simply dropped. Witnesses described the sound of a warhammer connecting with a helmet as something you did not forget. Not the clang of metal on metal, but a thick, sickening crunch. It was the kind of sound that told everyone nearby exactly what had just happened, even if they could not see it clearly. That was the moment a career in knighthood ended in a single brutal punctuation mark. We see this brutality in real battles. Take Agincourt. French knights marched in wearing top-tier armor, confident that their elite status and gear would carry the day. Instead, they got stuck in churned-up mud under waves of arrows, then found themselves on foot, exhausted, crowded, and unable to maneuver. English men-at-arms moved in with short weapons, like warhammers, and made that heavy armor a serious disadvantage. When you are sinking in mud and can barely move your legs, your armor stops being heroic protection and becomes luxury coffin. One of the reasons the warhammer spread so quickly was that it did not require fancy training. A sword demands years of practice to use with any real skill. Footwork, timing, angles, techniques. A warhammer, you need decent strength, a basic understanding of swing this at that person, and a willingness to hit hard. This made it a profoundly democratic weapon. You did not need noble birth or a lifetime of training. A tough commoner with a warhammer could threaten a fully trained knight in armor that cost more than a house. Social status did not matter when both skulls were equally crushable. In a dark way, it was medieval, user-friendly design. No complex manual required. Step 1, hold hammer. Step 2, face enemy. Step 3, swing until the problem stops moving. Archaeologists have dug up warhammers with heads weighing up to around 7 pounds mounted on handles close to a meter long. Put that on a battlefield and you have a weapon that combines reach, precision, impact, and terrifying momentum. Tests on good reproductions show just how much damage you can do even to hardened plate. In many cases, the hammer face on surviving weapons is polished smooth from repeated impacts. That is not a manufacturing choice, that is mileage. As armor developed and improved, weapon makers did not just sit still. Early warhammers were sometimes basically repurposed work tools. Later ones became high-tech killing instruments for their time. Longer spikes, stronger shafts, reinforced with metal, more carefully shaped hammer faces meant to grip and deform armor rather than just bounce off. By the 15th century, you start seeing warhammers that look like they were designed by someone who spent way too much time thinking about how to unalive a man in Milanese steel. This was the arms race in miniature. Better armor leads to better hammers, which leads to even better armor, and so on. The truly unfair part for knights was this: they spent their lives learning the knightly arts. Sword, lance, horsemanship, complex battlefield etiquette. Then they ride into combat and get their helmet dented shut by a guy whose main qualification is strong shoulders and a bad day. But that is the pattern you see again and again in medieval warfare. The more exclusive and elite something becomes, the more pressure there is to design a cheap, brutal counter that anyone can use. And the warhammer was only the beginning. If the warhammer was the dependable hit, hard problem-solved weapon of the age, the next weapon on our list is its chaotic cousin. Where the warhammer was predictable, the flail was anything but. It took the idea of hit your enemy and added a length of chain and a bunch of terrible life choices. In the next section, we're going to look at the spiked metal ball on a chain that turned battlefields, training grounds, and probably a lot of medical reports into a mess: the medieval flail. The flail looks like something designed by a committee that hated both the enemy and the person using it. At first glance, it seems simple. There is a wooden handle. There is a length of chain.
At the end of that chain hangs a heavy metal ball covered in spikes. That sounds straightforward enough, but the moment someone swings it, the whole thing stops behaving like a normal weapon and starts behaving like a physics experiment gone wrong.
Most weapons move more or less in sync with the person holding them. Swing a sword and the blade follows the path of your arm. Swing a hammer and the head tracks your motion. A flail refuses to cooperate. You move, the handle moves, and then the chain decides to do its own thing half a second later. The striking head lags behind, then whips past in a wild arc. Timing that arc, predicting exactly where the spike ball will be, is incredibly difficult. That is why training with a flail was not glamorous. It was painful. Historical descriptions mention long periods of practice devoted to one basic skill, hitting something other than your own body. Novices reportedly spent months just learning how not to smash their own knees, elbows, and skulls. Medieval instructors did not need elaborate tests. If a trainee walked into practice with bruises all over their arms and shoulders, they were probably working with a flail. Modern experimental fighters who try to learn this weapon end up telling similar stories. Bruised ribs, split lips, and broken fingers are a common theme. It is one of the few weapons in history that feels like it has a personal grudge against the user. It is not just dangerous to the person in front of it. It is dangerous to whoever dares pick it up. You could almost say the flail has a confirmed casualty list that includes both enemies and enthusiastic beginners. So with all of that risk, why did anyone stick with this thing instead of just grabbing a spear or a solid mace? The answer is in the chain. That flexible connection between handle and head creates problems for anyone trying to defend against it. Shields and rigid parries work well against straight-line attacks. A sword or a spear hits your shield and stops. A flail head can wrap around the edge, snake past the block, and still slam into a shoulder helmet or face. Imagine a knight raising a shield at exactly the right moment, textbook perfect, only to feel a spiked ball whip around the top like an angry metal comet. All that careful training in proper angles and timing suddenly feels less impressive when the weapon you are facing does not behave like a normal stick or blade. Defensive fighters who relied on neat, precise blocks found themselves dealing with chaos rushing in from unexpected angles. The physics of the flail added even more to the fear factor. As the chain whips around, it builds momentum. When that moving mass finally connects with a target, all of that energy focuses into the relatively small area of the spiked head. Tests on modern reconstructions suggest that a flail of similar weight can hit significantly harder than a solid club or mace simply because the flexible joint lets the head accelerate freely. Combine that extra speed with sharp spikes, and you have a weapon that can crack armor-dent helmets and punch through less sturdy metal like it is nothing. For heavily armored opponents, this meant their expensive gear could suddenly feel like decorative tin. Spikes concentrated the force into tiny points, creating deep punctures instead of shallow dents. A badly placed hit could turn a helmet into a sieve, rip through light mail, or break bones, even under layers of padding. It turned the idea of protection into a gamble. The armor might save you, or it might just collect the spikes for you. Weapon makers did not stop at the basic design either. The most common military version had a single chain and a single spiked ball, but more adventurous smiths created flails with 2 or 3 shorter chains branching from the same handle that multiplied the chaos. Now there were several spinning heads tracing overlapping arcs through the air, which made things terrifying for whoever faced it and deeply stressful for anyone standing too close to the person swinging it. One particularly nasty variant added sound to the mix. Some flails had hollow metal heads with small openings that made a whistling or howling noise when swung at full speed. Picture that on a dark, smoky battlefield, a strange, rising shriek cutting through the noise, followed by a heavy impact and someone collapsing. Even before the weapon connected, it was already attacking the nerves of anyone who heard it. It became an early form of psychological warfare, using dread as part of the design. Knights and professional soldiers took this threat seriously enough to develop specific counter techniques. Manuals and training traditions describe methods for reading the rhythm of the swing, stepping inside the flail's arc, or intercepting the handle before the head built up speed. None of this was easy. It required nerve and precise timing. Hesitation was dangerous. If you misjudged the distance, or the moment you met the business end of a spiked ball that had just completed a high-speed lap around the wielder's head, that difficulty created a unique kind of fear. It is one thing to face a weapon you understand, even if it is deadly. You know what a sword cut looks like. You know how a spear thrust works. A flail breaks those expectations. The movement feels wrong, the path is delayed, and the terminal speed is higher than it appears at first. On a crowded battlefield full of noise and dust, that unpredictability could freeze even experienced fighters for a split second, and a split second was enough. The flail also carried a social and political meaning in some regions. It did not begin as a pure battlefield invention. It grew out of the grain flail, a farming tool used to beat grain from husks. When revolts and uprisings broke out, peasants reached for what they knew. They took those agricultural tools, reinforced the joints, added iron caps and spikes, and walked out to face nobles in armor. A symbol of daily labor turned into a symbol of violent resistance. These improvised flails appeared in several major uprisings. They were cheap to make familiar in the hands of farmers, and surprisingly effective against cavalry that relied on close formations and predictable charges. One well-known example involves the Hussite forces in Bohemia, who became famous for their expert use of flails against fully armored opponents. In skilled hands, the swinging heads battered riders out of the saddle, smashed through helmet plates, and created ugly gaps in tightly packed formations. For wealthy knights, the sight of lines of commoners advancing with chains and spiked heads must have been unnerving. It represented more than just physical danger. It hinted that the entire social order, held together by armor horses and strict class lines, could be disrupted by clever use of something that started as a barn tool. The weapon turned the rhythm of farm work into the rhythm of battle. The flail earned a place in the nightmares of people who studied war seriously. It was not the most common weapon on the field, but its reputation grew larger than its numbers. It embodied chaos, risk, and unpredictability, not only for the target, but also for the wielder. It demanded courage, coordination, and a willingness to accept that you might lose track of your own weapon for a terrifying fraction of a second. Where some medieval weapons rewarded discipline and precise drills, the flail rewarded those brave enough to ride the chaos and make it work in their favor. Yet, not every deadly tool of the time leaned into unpredictability. Some went the opposite direction and embraced simple, brutal practicality. One of those tools looked almost boring at first glance: but it helped tear down the aura of invincibility around armored cavalry and gave common soldiers a very direct way to say hello to a charging knight. Picture a line of ordinary townsmen standing on a muddy field. No gleaming armor, no fancy coats of arms, no bloodline full of legendary warriors, just wool tunics, rough boots, and in their hands, what looks like an ugly wooden club with a single metal spike at the top. Nothing ornate, nothing impressive. That plain weapon helped change the balance of power in medieval warfare. In Flanders, people gave it a cheerful name that translates roughly to good day. It sounds friendly, like something you would say when you meet a neighbor in the market. On the battlefield, it delivered a very different kind of greeting. At first glance, it seems almost too simple to be interesting: a sturdy wooden shaft, thick enough to withstand impact, and a metal spike set into the end. No moving parts, no decorations, no complicated mechanics. Yet that simplicity is exactly what made it so dangerous. The key to understanding this weapon is to look at who used it and what they were up against. On one side, you have heavily armored French knights, the elite heavy cavalry of their time. They trained since childhood to ride war horses, handle lances and swords, and fight in close combat with other nobles. On the other side, you have weavers, merchants, and peasants who worked in crowded medieval cities and fields, not in noble training yards. Those common fighters could not afford plate armor and full cavalry kits. They needed something cheap, sturdy, and effective against a rider charging straight at them. That is where this ugly, brilliant club spike hybrid came in. The weapon combined two types of damage in one package. The sharp spike at the top could puncture armor, tear through a horse's chest, or punch into vulnerable joints. The heavy wooden body behind the spike could crush bones and helmets once an enemy was on the ground. One end to stop the charge, the rest to make sure the rider did not get back up. The most famous test for this design came at the Battle of Courtrai in 1302, also remembered as the Battle of the Golden Spurs. On one side, experienced French knights confident in their superiority. On the other, Flemish militias, made up largely of townspeople and peasants, armed with these club spike weapons, along with pikes and other polearms. The French were so sure of victory that they reportedly brought extra ropes and wagons to carry home their prisoners for ransom. It was meant to be profitable. It turned into a disaster. The Flemish infantry used clever positioning and terrain, but the weapon in their hands did a lot of the talking. As the French cavalry charged, Flemish fighters planted the bases of their weapons on the ground, angled the spikes forward, and turned the front ranks into a living wall of upward-pointing steel. A horse, moving at full speed, could not simply stop in front of that, and a knight locked into a charge by momentum had very few options. In that moment, the expensive armor, the years of noble training, the decorated harnesses and horses all met a simple question: what happens when a spear-like spike is braced firmly and a charging mass runs into it? The answer was brutal. Horses were impaled or tripped. Riders were thrown from the saddle and hit the ground in heavy armor that made it hard to stand quickly. Once a knight was down and dazed, the same weapon that had acted like a spear suddenly became a club. That wooden shaft swung downward could crack a helmet, crush a hand reaching for a sword, or smash a visor inward. The field at Courtrai reportedly ended up covered with fallen knights and their broken hopes, and also with gilded spurs that nobles wore to show off their status. Those spurs were collected after the battle and hung as trophies, which is how the fight got its alternative name. It was a visual summary of what had happened. Common fighters with simple tools had brought down the most glamorous warriors in Europe. The economic contrast was stark. A full knightly kit of armor, horse, and weapons could cost a fortune. The spiked club cost a tiny fraction of that. Some historians estimate that one of these weapons could be produced for a small slice of the price of a single suit of plate. When a tool that cheap can defeat something that expensive military planners pay attention. Crafting the weapon did not require legendary master smiths. The spike demanded competent metalwork, but a local blacksmith could manage that. The shaft needed to be strong and straight, often made from ash or oak, which many woodworkers already knew how to handle. If a town needed hundreds of weapons, it did not have to beg aristocrats for help. It could simply put its own craftsmen to work. That accessibility changed how fast militias could arm themselves. During revolts and regional conflicts, records describe towns equipping large numbers of citizens in a matter of weeks. Instead of a small group of elite fighters, you could suddenly have dense blocks of trained infantry who all knew how to use the same tool in the same way. Training did not take years. Instructors mostly had to teach formation discipline and a few core techniques. Brace the butt on the ground when facing a charge. Keep the line tight so that no gaps appear. Angle the spike to meet the chest of the horse, not the armored shield of the rider. Once an enemy falls, shift grip and strike with the weight of the shaft, not just the tip. Those concepts could be drilled into recruits quickly through repetition. Over time, variations appeared. Some versions had shorter shafts meant for fighting in tighter ranks where long weapons would get tangled. Others stretched out to nearly the height of a man and a half, giving the front line more reach against incoming cavalry. The spike itself might be thick and pyramidal, better for shattering plate and helmets, or longer and thinner, designed to slip between armor plates and through chain links. These differences show that people were paying close attention to what worked on real battlefields. The spiked club was not a crude one-time experiment. It was a living design that evolved as users learned what angles, lengths, and weights were most effective. The psychological shock from courtry was enormous. For generations, knights had treated infantry as background noise, important sometimes, but clearly second class. After this battle, that illusion cracked. Chronicles from the period show nobles suddenly writing about militia fighters with new respect and, just as importantly, with fear. They had seen what happened when disciplined townsmen with the right weapons decided they were not going to run. The effect rippled outward across Europe. Commanders realized they could not rely purely on cavalry dominance. Infantry armed with hybrid tools like this one, or with more advanced polearms that grew from the same idea, could block charges, break momentum, and even counterattack effectively. The ground units stopped being passive obstacles and became active threats. Polearms such as halberds and similar weapons developed some of their key concepts from this kind of battlefield experience. The idea of combining a thrusting point with a heavy striking surface appears again and again in later designs. A spear alone can pierce, a hammer alone can crush, but a combined form can do both, depending on how the user chooses to move. Even when more elaborate polearms came into fashion, the simple spiked club did not disappear overnight. It stayed in service with militia forces, city guards, and rebels who needed something quick and reliable. In some regions, it remained a symbol of citizen resistance, a reminder that expensive armor and noble pedigrees did not guarantee control of the battlefield. The larger lesson that grew from this weapon was uncomfortable for the upper classes. Technology does not need to be complicated to be revolutionary. Sometimes the breakthrough is not a finely balanced blade or a rare alloy. Sometimes it is a stout stick with a sharp point and a training system that lets ordinary people use it together. As armor and cavalry tactics continue to evolve, new tools emerged to counter these changes. Some of them pushed weapon design toward impressive size and spectacle, creating blades so massive and dramatic that they looked like something out of a legend. Those enormous swords were not just for show. They were built for one very specific and terrifying job: smashing apart the tight formations that gave infantry so much power. Imagine walking onto a battlefield and seeing a warrior carrying a sword that is almost as tall as he is. Not a decorative prop, not a parade piece, but a real weapon meant to be used at full speed. That is the world of the gigantic two-handed sword, the kind of blade that turned heads before it even left its scabbard. These swords, often called great swords or Zweienders in the German tradition, routinely reached 5 or 6 feet in length. Some unusual examples pushed even higher, turning into towering strips of sharpened steel. The grip alone might be long enough for both hands to fit with room to spare. The blade stretched above that like a steel banner. The weight did not sound ridiculous on paper, usually in the range of 7 to maybe 14 pounds, but the problem was not the number on the scale. The problem was what it meant to swing that much metal in real combat. Try moving a heavy bar around at speed over and over while people are trying to kill you. That weight becomes very real after the first minute. Modern martial artists who experiment with replicas usually discover the same thing. The first few swings feel powerful and dramatic. After that, the arms start to burn, the shoulders complain, and control begins to slip. The people who used these weapons for real needed exceptional conditioning. They were not just strong in a casual way. They lived in a constant training loop so they could keep that blade moving without collapsing. In late medieval and early modern Germany, a special class of mercenary soldiers became famous for handling these massive swords. They were known as Landsknechts, professional troops who fought for pay across Europe. Among them, the specialists who trained with the huge two-handed swords earned double wages and a certain amount of celebrity. Pay records, artwork, and descriptions from the time all highlight these warriors as standouts. The reason for that higher pay was simple. The job was incredibly dangerous, but potentially decisive. These fighters were not meant to sit safely in the back. Their main task was to confront enemy pike formations head-on and break them apart. Pike squares were dense blocks of soldiers holding long spears, often 16 feet or more in length. Those formations dominated late medieval battlefields. They were like moving forests of sharpened poles. Most infantry hated the idea of charging into that kind of wall. The long points could stop cavalry crush, uncoordinated attacks, and hold entire armies in place. The two-handed sword specialists were hired to do something reckless and important. They ran straight at the pikes, used the reach of their giant blades, and tried to chop through the spear shafts, disrupt the front rank, and create openings for friendly troops to rush in. If you picture that scene, you can see why double pay suddenly feels like the bare minimum. Long steel blades swinging in wide arcs, splintering wooden shafts, snapping pike heads away and forcing the front line of the enemy to stumble and recoil. Once the formation lost its tight shape, other soldiers could follow through the gaps and turn a solid block into a swirling brawl. The design of these swords supported that role. Many examples include a section of blunt reinforced steel just above the guard called a ricasso. This area was often wrapped in leather or cord. It allowed the user to slide one hand up from the main grip and hold the blade itself for better leverage in close-range work. It was like giving the weapon a second forward grip for fine control or half-sword technique. Just above the ricasso on many blades, small protruding parrying hooks or lugs stick out from each side. These could protect the forward hand, catch enemy weapons, or brace the sword when it was used to knock aside pikes. Combined with a long reach and heavy weight, they turned the two-handed sword into a multi-role tool. It could cut, thrust, hook, and shove. On the battlefield, the visual impact of these fighters mattered almost as much as the raw damage. Imagine standing in a packed formation, holding your pike in a rigid line, and seeing tall mercenaries walking forward with 6-foot blades resting casually on their shoulders. The silhouette alone felt unnatural. Regular soldiers looked like men with weapons. These specialists looked like walking executions waiting to happen. Many chroniclers mention how enemy lines recoiled or hesitated when these sword-bearers advanced. The intimidation factor was real. It is one thing to face a sword that is roughly the length of your arm. It is another to see a blade that can reach you while still being far outside your comfortable striking range. That kind of psychological pressure bends morale. Training for this weapon focused on controlling its momentum. Short swords reward quick, sharp changes of direction. Huge blades require a different philosophy. Manuals show stances and movements that flow continuously, using the weight of the weapon as a guide instead of fighting against it. The idea is to let the sword describe wide circles, redirecting its path with the body rather than stopping and starting suddenly. The best users moved with surprising grace. Instead of a clumsy, heavy swing, the blade spun in smooth arcs, cutting through the air with the efficiency of a scythe. Done correctly, each motion set up the next one. The wielder stayed in motion, never fully static, always ready to adjust to a new threat with the next turn of the shoulders or shift of the hips. These swords had other tactical uses aside from formation breaking. Defending narrow spaces was a perfect job for them. If you put a strong fighter with a two-handed sword at the top of a stairway or in a gateway, they could control an entire choke point. The long reach and heavy cutting power meant that several attackers at once could be kept at bay. Anyone trying to rush that position risked losing limbs or worse. Historical examples describe such moments in city sieges and battles where a handful of these swords held crucial positions. The blade acted like a moving barrier that was difficult to slip past. In close quarters, a slash from such a weapon did not simply wound. It often crippled or killed outright. Despite all this, these gigantic swords never became standard issue. They were too expensive and too demanding. Crafting one required large quantities of good steel and a smith skilled enough to create a blade that was both strong and flexible. If it was too brittle, it could snap under stress. If it was too soft, it would bend and stay bent. On top of that, only a minority of soldiers had the physique and discipline to use them properly. For that reason, many great swords ended up as prestige objects as much as practical tools. Surviving examples in museums often have etched designs, gilded inscriptions, and elaborate hilts. Some were clearly intended for ceremony or parades. They symbolized the power and ferocity of the units that used them. They were like walking banners, but made of steel. Yet, even the decorative pieces trace their origin back to a very practical purpose. Every flourish and carving sits on top of a design that began as a solution to a real battlefield problem. Strong infantry formations needed to be broken. Dense pike blocks needed a counter. A handful of warriors with giant swords became that answer for a period of time. Not every medieval invention focused on hitting harder, however. Some were built around a very different goal. Sometimes the most profitable result in war was not a corpse, but a living, breathing prisoner who could be ransomed. That goal produced tools that looked less like weapons and more like long-handled traps, ready to grab a very expensive target and drag it out of the fight alive. Some medieval weapons were built to smash, slice, or puncture. Others were built to get you paid. The man-catcher sits firmly in that second category. It did not look like a heroic knightly weapon. It looked like something invented by a practical person who had stared at a fully armored noble and thought you were worth more alive than dead. I need a way to grab you, drag you off your horse, and keep you breathing long enough for the paperwork. At its core, the man-catcher was a long wooden pole with a metal collar on the end. That collar was not a smooth ring. It had hinges, prongs, and inward-pointing spikes or barbs. When pushed around a victim's neck, arm, or shoulder and then twisted, the collar would snap tight. The spikes dug in just enough to discourage escape, but not so strongly that they killed the target instantly. It was not a gentle device. It hurt. It cut. It humiliated. But compared to a warhammer or a morning star, it was practically mercy. Understanding why anyone would bother with such a strange weapon means looking at the business side of medieval war. Knights and nobles were not just warriors. They were walking bundles of wealth. They wore armor that cost a fortune, rode trained horses, and held land and titles. Capturing one could bring in a ransom so large that it changed the future of a family, a town, or even an entire military unit. A dead knight gave you his armor, his weapons, maybe his horse. A live knight came with letters, negotiations, and a large pile of money at the end, if everything went well. There are records of ransoms worth years of tax income for a single important noble. Armies paid attention to that kind of math. The man-catcher was a tool built to exploit that math. On the battlefield, the ideal target for this thing was mounted, well-armored, and important. The user would stay a little back from the heaviest fighting, watching for a moment when a knight became isolated or slowed. Then the pole would shoot out, that metal collar open like a jaw. The aim was to slip it around the neck, shoulder, or upper chest, then twist and pull. A horseman who suddenly found a metal ring constricting his throat from an angle he could not fully see had a serious problem. The person on the other end of the pole would wrench downward or sideways. Even a strong rider could be hauled off balance. With help from other soldiers, the target could be yanked from the saddle completely. Once on the ground, that prize in shining armor became surprisingly helpless. Plate and mail are great when you can move freely. They are less great when several people are pulling you in different directions and your neck is trapped in a spiked collar. The man-catcher team could keep their distance and still control you. Any attempt to fight back or jerk away just drove the spikes deeper. The weapon rewarded teamwork. Manuals and descriptions talk about groups of 3 to 5 people working together. One soldier wielded the man-catcher itself, focusing on control and leverage. The others carried more conventional weapons and shields, ready to block rescue attempts, disarm the prisoner, or tie him up once he hit the ground. On a chaotic field, that kind of coordinated effort around a single target was reserved for someone worth serious money. The design took advantage of one very simple fact. Medieval helmets often restricted side vision. Many visors blocked the peripheral view so thoroughly that a fighter had to turn his whole head to check what was happening beside him. That meant a long pole creeping in from a blind spot could close in before the victim realized what was happening. Some armor designs even accidentally helped the man-catcher work better. Raised neck plates, decorative collars, and ridged shoulder pieces could give the metal ring something to snag against, making it harder for the victim to slip out. As soon as the idea proved itself on the battlefield, local variations started to appear. Some versions used extra long poles, especially in regions where heavy cavalry was common. This allowed infantry to reach up to riders from outside sword range. Other designs, in more urban areas, used shorter poles that were easier to maneuver in tight streets or castle corridors. The collar mechanisms also changed from place to place. Some had a hinged half ring that snapped shut when pushed around the neck with a locking catch that clicked into place. Others used two curved arms that squeezed inward, guided by a sliding ring on the outside. A few elaborate designs included small internal hooks that bit in deeper the more the captured person struggled. There's a kind of cold logic in that. The more you panic and thrash, the worse it feels, so eventually most prisoners decide that stillness is the only intelligent choice. The man-catcher also found a role away from full-scale battles. City guards and palace watch units used similar tools to deal with unruly crowds or to detain dangerous suspects without immediately killing them. In a narrow street, swinging a sword wildly could start a riot. Hooking someone with a pole and dragging them out of the crowd allowed authorities to remove key troublemakers while keeping lethal force in reserve. That does not mean this was a gentle law enforcement method. Being pinned in a spiked collar and yanked around by a group of armored guards was humiliating and painful. The message was clear. The authorities could reach into a mob and pull you out like a fish on a hook. Predictably, people on the receiving end tried to adapt. Some knights began reinforcing the upper parts of their armor specifically to resist these devices. Thick metal collars, extra plates along the spine, and raised ridges on the breastplate made it harder for the ring to rest securely around the neck. Others focused on changing tactics, training to spot long poles in the hands of infantry and target those soldiers quickly. Man-catcher operators became high-priority targets. If a knight saw one, he knew that person wanted to turn him from a proud warrior into a walking ransom number. That awareness could create dangerous little duels inside the larger battle. The man-catcher reached out. The knight tried to cut the pole, stab the wielder, or slam his horse through the line before the trap closed. Interestingly, this family of tools survived changes in battlefield technology that killed off many older weapons. Even after firearms started dominating combat, the basic idea of a long-handled capture hook remained useful. As gunpowder made killing easier at range, situations where someone needed to be controlled without being shot still existed, especially in policing and guard work. Variants of the man-catcher appeared in law enforcement toolkits centuries later. The shapes and materials changed, but the logic stayed the same. A long stick with a controlled capture mechanism at the end gives you distance, leverage, and authority all in one. There is a dark irony in this kind of device. It looks less dramatic than a glittering sword or a huge axe, but it often represented a much harsher fate. A clean death in battle meant the story ended quickly. Being captured by a pole with a collar at the end meant negotiations, months of confinement, and family fortunes strained to buy freedom. Where the man-catcher focused on restraint and profit, other medieval creations did not bother with subtlety or financial planning. They were built with a single objective in mind: destroy whatever they touched in the most direct and terrifying way possible, even through heavy armor that would have shrugged off lesser blows. If you tried to design a weapon based entirely on nightmares, you would get very close to the Morning Star. It does not try to be elegant. It does not pretend to be honorable. It is simply a heavy metal ball covered in spikes, mounted on a handle, built for the sole purpose of ruining whatever body part it lands on. At first glance, it looks a bit like a mace that went through a bad mood. The structure is straightforward. There is a wooden or metal shaft you grip with one or two hands. At the top sits a round metal head with spikes sticking out in every direction. Some heads are fairly small, roughly the size of an apple. Others are massive, closer to a large orange or even a small melon, with thick spikes that jut out several centimeters. That shape is not just for intimidation. Every spike concentrates the force of a swing into a tiny point. When the weapon connects with armor, all the momentum slams into those tips first. Instead of a broad area of impact that spreads the force, you get a handful of tiny, vicious pressure points. Metal that might deflect a sword edge suddenly has to deal with several sharp teeth trying to bite through it at the same time. The physics behind this is brutal. A strong fighter swings the Morning Star in a wide arc. The heavy head picks up speed. When it crashes into a helmet, breastplate, or shield, the spikes try to dig in. If the armor is thin or poorly made, they can punch through, completely carrying splinters of metal inward like shrapnel. If the armor is thick enough to resist full penetration, the spikes still dent the surface deeply and transmit force into the bone underneath. Battlefield injuries linked to weapons like this often show a double pattern. You get puncture marks on the outside and shattered bone inside. A skull might show neat circular holes in the bone surface, but the inner structure is cracked and broken in a way that tells you one thing very clearly: that head was not ready for the amount of force it just met. Medieval medicine was not equipped to deal with this kind of damage. A clean cut from a sword, while terrible, sometimes could be stitched or bound. A smashed limb, full of metal fragments and crushed bone, was a different story. Infection, nerve damage, and long-term disability were common outcomes for those who managed to survive the initial strike. The weapon did not require fancy technique to be dangerous, but it did demand serious physical strength. Training guides from the period mention exercises for the shoulders, arms, and back specifically aimed at building the power to swing heavy striking heads repeatedly. Some soldiers practiced with overweight versions to build stamina, then switched to their actual battlefield weapon, which suddenly felt light by comparison. Once a fighter had the necessary conditioning, the Morning Star rewarded simple, direct tactics. From horseback, shorter shafts allowed mounted warriors to slam the spiked head down on enemy helmets as they rode past. The height advantage and the speed of the horse combined to turn each hit into a devastating impact from above. On foot, longer handles gave infantry enough reach to keep enemies at distance, while delivering sideways or diagonal strikes that could break a shield guard or knock an opponent off balance. Tactically, these weapons worked well in tight formation. Imagine a line of infantry with shield bearers at the front and Morning Star users just behind them. The front rank blocks and holds. The second rank swings around the edges or over the top, sending spiked heads crashing into anyone who gets too close. That combination could turn a frontal assault into a very expensive lesson. The visual effect of facing fighters armed with morning stars should not be underestimated. Seeing rows of spiked balls glinting in the light taps into something very basic in the human brain. There is a clear message in that design. This thing is not meant to carve around your armor in a clean line. It is meant to punch through and leave holes. Commanders knew how powerful that fear could be. In some armies, soldiers with these weapons were placed where the enemy could see them most clearly. The goal was simple. Before blades even touched the other side, would already be wrestling with the thought of those spikes swinging toward their faces. The design also proved flexible across regions. In parts of Eastern Europe, versions appeared with more spikes that were shorter and denser, better suited to punching through lighter armor and thick clothing. In Western Europe, where full-plate armor became more common, some morning stars featured fewer spikes that were longer and heavier to dig into hardened steel. Even with these differences, the core idea remained the same. A heavy head, aggressive spikes, and the ability to deliver bone-breaking blows. Outside the battlefield, the image of the morning star took on a kind of symbolic life. Artists sometimes placed similar spiked heads in scenes of punishment or damnation. It became a visual shorthand for severe consequences, both physical and spiritual. If a painting wanted to show that someone was facing serious divine or legal anger, adding a spiked club in the corner sent that message immediately. There is even a darkly humorous nickname that appears in some sources comparing the weapon to a kind of violent sprinkler. The spikes caused blood to spray in all directions when the weapon connected with flesh. That gruesome detail turned into bitter humor among soldiers who saw these injuries up close. Laughing at horror was one way to cope with it. Public authorities picked up on the symbolism. In some towns, stylized spiked heads were placed above gates or on the walls of important buildings. They were not functional weapons in that context. They were warnings carved in metal, a reminder that the people in charge were willing and able to inflict pain on anyone who stepped too far out of line. For all its savagery, the Morning Star was still a relatively straightforward tool. Swing, hit, destroy. It did one thing and did it very well. At the same time, other designers looked for ways to combine multiple types of damage into a single, more controlled instrument. They wanted something that could pierce, smash, and thrust all while taking advantage of a long shaft for leverage against heavily armored enemies. Among all the polearms of the medieval world, few looked as purpose-built for killing armored people as the bec de Corbin, often translated as Raven's Beak. The name alone gives away the weapon's personality. It suggests something sharp, hooked, and patient, waiting for the perfect moment to strike at a vulnerable spot. Take a long hardwood shaft, usually around the height of a person or a little more. Mount a metal head at the top that looks like three weapons welded into one. On one side, a curved spike shaped like a bird's beak tapering to a fine point. On the opposite side, a compact hammerhead or block ideal for smashing and denting. At the very top, a straight spike pointing forward, ready to thrust like a spear. That is the basic layout. 3 different attack styles built into one tool. Piercing with the beak, crushing with the hammer, and stabbing with the top spike. You could choose in an instant which surface to use depending on what you were facing. Soft armor invited a deep thrust. Plate armor called for the hook or hammer. A mounted knight presented legs, arms, and gaps that could be snagged or smashed. The genius of the design lies in how it uses leverage. A long handle turns even a modest swing into something serious. When that long lever focuses, all of its energy into the tiny tip of a hardened spike, the pressure on impact becomes enormous. Good plate armor could resist glancing sword cuts and even shallow hits from blunt weapons, but a narrow beak, driven with that much force, could punch right through it. Descriptions from the time talk about the awful scraping shriek made when a beak like this dug into metal. The sound began as a high squeal as the point skidded across the armor, then shifted into a heavier impact when it finally bit in and reached the body underneath. Veterans learned to recognize that noise instantly. If you heard it nearby, it usually meant that someone had just suffered a very bad moment. Soldiers who trained with the bec de Corbin treated it as a precision tool, rather than just a long stick to swing wildly. Manuals describe drills that focus on targeting joints' edges and weak spots instead of smashing at random. The armpit, the back of the knee, the visor area, and the overlapping plates along the spine were all prime targets. A fighter who learned to aim at these openings could turn even the best armor into a suggestion rather than a guarantee. The curved beak was particularly good at catching and pulling. It could hook the rim of a shield or the edge of a breastplate and yank an opponent off balance. If the person was mounted, the hook might find purchase on the saddle or parts of the armor and drag the rider down. As soon as the knight lost the advantage of height and momentum, the polearm user could switch to hammer strikes or top spike thrusts to finish the job. Infantry units armed with these weapons gained a new kind of confidence against cavalry. Instead of fearing the charge and hoping to survive the impact, they could plant their feet, set their shafts, and use distance to their advantage. The long reach let them threaten riders before those riders got close enough to swing a sword effectively. A line of infantry lined up with these beaked heads pointing outward looked like a hedge of metal thorns. The hammer face on the opposite side of the beak was not just an afterthought. It provided a blunt option for moments when smashing was better than piercing. If the beak could not find a gap, the hammer could still dent armor deeply enough to stun or break bones. A solid hit to the helmet might leave the wearer seeing stars or lying unconscious in the mud. Choosing between the beak and the hammer became a tactical decision made in fractions of a second. Crafting a good bec de Corbin required serious skill. The head needed to be hardened in all the right places. The beak had to be sharp and sturdy without snapping under strain. The hammer face needed to hold its shape after repeated blows. The top spike needed to be aligned with the shaft, so thrusts went exactly where the fighter intended. Blacksmiths balanced hardness with flexibility, carefully controlling how the metal cooled to avoid brittle failures. The shaft was just as important. Ash and oak were popular choices due to their combination of strength and flexibility. A weak or poorly prepared shaft could split or shatter under the stress of combat, leaving the warrior holding a useless stick with a loose head. To prevent this, craftsmen reinforced the socket where metal met wood, often wrapping that area with additional bands of iron. From a distance, ranks of soldiers carrying these weapons created a very specific visual impression. The curved beaks all pointed forward like a flock of hunting birds frozen in mid-lunge. Light glinted along the spikes and hammer faces. To heavily armored knights who had spent fortunes on their equipment, the sight of tools clearly built to defeat that investment was unsettling. Different regions adapted the basic design to their needs. Italian versions tended to have longer, narrower beaks that focused on punching through especially high-quality plate produced in cities like Milan. These beaks acted like can openers for elite armor. French and Burgundian versions sometimes favored broader hammer faces, striking a closer balance between crushing and piercing force. In Central and Eastern Europe, extra hooks or prongs appeared, turning the weapon into an even more effective tool for pulling riders from their saddles or sweeping enemy weapons aside. The lifespan of the bec de corbin on the battlefield was impressively long. It appeared in the later medieval period and stayed in active military use for generations, even as new armor styles and tactics emerged. The fundamental problem it addressed never truly went away. As long as soldiers wore heavy armor and fought in close quarters, a long pole with a multi-purpose metal head remained extremely useful. Beyond combat, the basic concept behind this weapon influenced later designs and even modern tools. The idea of combining a piercing element with a prying edge and a hammer surface shows up in many specialized implements today. Breaching tools used by some emergency or tactical teams echo the same logic in steel and composite handles. They bash, hook, and dig, just in a very different environment. The bec de corbin represents a particular moment of balance in weapon evolution. It belongs to the world of hand-to-hand fighting, yet it already hints at a more technical, calculated approach to warfare. Every angle, weight, and curve exists to solve a specific problem: how to defeat a human wrapped in steel at the distance of a long arm. At the same time that polearms like this were reaching their peak, another group of engineers was working on a very different kind of solution. Instead of focusing on arm-length fights, they asked a new question: how do you reach out far beyond that distance and kill an enemy you might barely be able to see long before they can touch you at all? Imagine standing on a fortress wall, looking out over a field, and knowing that somewhere beyond the edge of clear vision sits a machine pointed in your direction. You cannot see it clearly. You cannot swing a sword at it. You cannot charge it on horseback in a few seconds. Yet at any moment, something the size of a fence post could fly in at incredible speed and nail you to the battlement. That creeping awareness is the world of the ballista. A ballista was essentially a gigantic crossbow that had given up all subtlety. Instead of a compact wooden bow and a modest string, it relied on thick bundles of twisted material and massive arms that resembled the limbs of a siege beast. The basic idea was simple: store a huge amount of energy in tightly wound ropes or sinew cords, pull back a heavy projectile along a track, then release everything in one explosive movement. The materials that held the energy were often made from animal sinew hair or strong rope. These bundles were wound tight and held in sturdy wooden frames. At the end of each twisted bundle, a rigid arm extended forward, creating something that looked a little like a giant slingshot. A heavy bowstring connected the tips of the arms, and a launch rail stretched out in front to guide the bolt. Loading this machine was not a one-person task. Crews used winches, cranks, and pulley systems to haul the string back. The effort was considerable. Each shot represented a small engineering project. Once the string was locked into position, a bolt or large dart was placed on the rail. Some bolts were simple, sharpened poles. Others had metal heads designed for piercing armor or damaging wooden fortifications. When the trigger device released, the arms snapped forward under the power of the twisted bundles. The string rocketed the bolt along the rail and into the air at high speed. The projectile did not rise in the slow arc of an arrow shower. It flew on a much flatter, faster path. To anyone watching from the target side, it almost seemed to appear out of nowhere, slamming into shields, bodies, or stone with brutal impact. A well-built ballista could throw bolts that weighed dozens of pounds at speeds fast enough to punch through several ranks of soldiers. The results were ugly. A single hit might pass through a shield a man and the person behind him before burying itself in the ground. Close formations that felt relatively safe against ordinary arrows suddenly discovered that there were now gaps in their lines created by a single massive spike. Operating these machines required specialized skills. Crews had to understand not only the loading process, but also aiming, range estimation, and maintenance. Too much tension could damage the frame or snap the arms. Too little would reduce penetration. The ropes and sinew bundles needed careful attention since weather and moisture could weaken them. A good crew became a tight team that moved through the steps almost automatically. Rate of fire was limited compared to regular archers, but a few carefully aimed bolts could cause far more chaos than a whole volley of arrows. 2 or 3 shots a minute might not sound impressive, but each shot had the potential to change the shape of a defensive line or clear a section of wall. Commanders used ballistas in several ways. In open battle, they targeted tightly packed enemy units or key individuals, such as officers carrying banners or shouting orders. Taking down a leader in front of his troops could start a ripple of confusion that turned into a full breakdown. During sieges, ballistas turned their attention to defenders on walls, towers, and behind parapets. Anyone who stayed in the same spot too long risked becoming an easy mark. The psychological strain on defenders under this kind of fire was intense. There are accounts of soldiers developing a constant flinch reflex, ducking at any unexpected sound. Casualties were bad enough. The waiting could be worse. Not knowing when or where the next invisible bolt would arrive chipped away at morale. Machines of different sizes appeared to suit different tactical needs. Some ballistas were relatively compact and could be mounted on wheeled carriages. These could roll along roads or be repositioned quickly as the battle shifted. Field commanders liked these portable versions because they could be used for ambushes or to support attacking infantry. Larger ballistas served more as fixed artillery pieces. Once assembled in a siege camp, they were difficult to move. Their size, however, meant that they could handle heavier projectiles. Some of these massive engines used stone balls or heavy bolts with reinforced heads that could crack masonry, shatter wooden gates, or break scaffolding along defensive walls. Keeping one of these giants supplied was a logistical challenge. Crews needed replacement strings, spare arms, extra bolts, and repair materials. If a single component failed during battle, the entire machine could be disabled. Armies that relied on ballistas had to bring along carpenters, rope makers, and smiths just to keep the engines functional. Yet, despite all the effort involved, the strategic payoff could be enormous. A single well-placed bolt could reduce a section of defensive wall to a death zone. Anyone trying to man that section knew that a machine with inhuman patience was watching them from somewhere beyond the horizon of dust and smoke. These engines also encouraged new forms of protection. Defenders built wooden screens, thicker parapets, and angled walls specifically to deal with large projectiles. They dug deeper trenches and used earthen banks that could absorb impact better than bare stone. Just as armor forced the creation of specialized hand weapons, long-range siege engines pushed architects and builders to rethink how fortifications should look. It was not just about raw killing power. The very presence of ballistas in a siege camp or on a ridge overlooking an army changed how people moved. Officers avoided standing on high ground or silhouetting themselves on walls. Messengers ran lower and hugged cover whenever possible. People adopted new habits of survival based on the knowledge that a heavy bolt might be crossing the field at any time. For all its strengths, the ballista still focused on a relatively small number of targets with each shot. It was a scalpel at giant scale, deadly but selective. Military engineers were not satisfied with killing one or a few people at a time. They wanted tools that could tear into large groups, crush structures, and terrify entire cities with a single throw. On many medieval battlefields, the real danger did not always come from the giant engines crashing stones into walls. Sometimes it came from a much smaller frame set up quietly in the distance, pointed at a very specific person. That is the role of the scorpion. If the ballista was a heavy crossbow on a grand scale, the scorpion was its faster, leaner cousin. It used the same basic concept of twisted energy bundles, driving a pair of arms forward, but everything was tightened down and focused for quick handling and fine control. Picture a stout wooden frame, roughly the size of a small cart, with two torsion bundles at the back and a narrow shooting bed running out front. It looks like a piece of furniture built by someone with a personal grudge. Instead of hurling massive bolts the size of fence posts, the scorpion fired slimmer dart-like projectiles. These were still larger than normal arrows, often with thick wooden shafts and iron heads, but they were light enough to fly very fast. The smaller mass meant that each shot did not tear through entire squads the way a huge ballista bolt could. Instead, it went in search of individual victims. The torsion system was similar in principle to its big brother. Bundles of twisted sinew or rope sat in sockets, each gripping a rigid arm. A string connected the arms, and a windlass or crank system pulled that string back along the shooting bed. When the catch released, the arms snapped forward under torsion power and flung the dart downrange at high speed. The real advantage came from the way this machine could be aimed and repositioned. Crews mounted scorpions on swivel bases or narrow carriages that allowed quick adjustments. The frame was light enough that a small team could pivot it, push it to a new angle along the wall, or even move it to a different firing position entirely as the fight shifted. A practiced crew could send shot after shot downrange in a steady rhythm. Some units reached firing speeds of close to 10 bolts per minute in ideal conditions. While those numbers probably dropped under the chaos of real combat, it still represented a remarkable rate for such a powerful weapon. A scorpion did not throw out a random storm of arrows. It released a rapid series of precise stabs at chosen points on the battlefield. That accuracy changed how commanders thought about safety. Banner carriers, officers in distinctive armor, signalers, engineers, and anyone else whose presence mattered more than the average soldier suddenly became high-value targets. A scorpion team with a clear line of sight could pick them out one by one. Imagine being that officer standing on a wall or ridge pointing, shouting, trying to keep your troops in order. You know that somewhere in the distance a crew is watching, adjusting sights, measuring distance. One shot flies and misses by a few feet, carving a groove into the stone beside you. The next one will be corrected. Now every movement feels exposed. The psychological effect of that kind of threat was immense. Defenders began to describe a sort of constant dread that crept in during long sieges. It was not the roaring of giant engines or the crash of stones that unnerved them. It was the quiet moments, the seconds when nothing seemed to be happening, yet they knew that somewhere a crew was cranking back the arms and lining up the next shot. Chroniclers gave nicknames to this experience. Some wrote about the feeling of invisible stings striking from far away. Others used phrases that translate roughly to waiting for the sting. The tension did not come from steady noise. It came from silence, interrupted at random by the harsh impact of a dart slamming into wood masonry or flesh. Morale issues under this kind of pressure became a real concern. Defenders started ducking behind merlons for longer than necessary, timing their movements to the perceived rhythm of incoming fire. Responsibilities that required standing at exposed points began to feel like punishments. Officers had to push and cajole reluctant soldiers back into positions where they would be visible to enemy crews. From the attacker's side, scorpions proved especially useful in sieges where the goal was to thin out key defenders rather than smash the walls immediately. Setting them up behind protective screens and ramparts allowed crews to operate with relative safety. They could sight along narrow openings, fire, and then step back while reloading. In open battles, light scorpions found roles on hills behind advancing infantry or in gaps between heavier engines. They targeted enemy archers, officers, and shield bearers. Clearing out those individuals opened the door for friendly troops to push forward. A scorpion team that eliminated a standard bearer or sergeant at the right moment could cause a ripple of confusion, turning a firm line into a hesitant one. The construction of these weapons demanded careful work. The torsion bundles needed to be uniform so that both arms delivered equal force. The shooting bed had to be straight and smooth, with guides that kept the dart from wobbling as it launched. Even small imperfections could reduce accuracy or cause dangerous misfires. Teams were often made up of specialists, some of whom were more engineers than traditional fighters. Over time, armies refined the design, experimenting with different materials and shapes. Iron fittings reinforced the wood. Adjustable sights appeared on some versions, allowing more precise elevation control. Crews kept records of distances to key points on the battlefield, building a mental map of how far to crank the arms and at what angle to set the frame. Defenders tried to respond with their own countermeasures. Extra layers of wood, straw, and earth went up behind stone parapets to absorb incoming darts. Shields were stacked along exposed walkways. Some garrisons created false firing positions, complete with dummy figures dressed like officers, in the hope of tricking enemy crews into wasting shots. Even with these efforts, the threat never fully went away. A dart that missed its intended target could still shatter bone or pin someone to a wall. The machine did not care whether it struck a captain or a low-ranking guard. Once released, the shot did whatever gravity and aim dictated. In many ways, the Scorpion foreshadowed the idea of precision-ranged weapons that would eventually dominate later eras. It represented an early step toward a battlefield where skill with aiming and understanding of distance mattered as much as courage in close combat. It rewarded calm observation, calculation, and an almost clinical approach to choosing who lived and who did not. While machines like this brought a new kind of order to killing at range, medieval engineers were also busy building devices that abandoned precision in favor of overwhelming, crushing power. Those engines did not care about individual targets. They treated walls, towers, and entire sections of cities as single objects to be smashed apart with raw, terrifying force. If medieval warfare had a king of siege engines, it would be the trebuchet. Nothing else combined size, power, and theatrical drama quite like it. This was not a weapon you could ignore. When a trebuchet appeared outside your walls, it was like seeing a giant wooden verdict. Your fortress was officially on borrowed time. The basic idea sounds simple on paper. Take a long wooden arm, fix it to a sturdy frame, so it can pivot, hang a massive counterweight on the short end, and attach a sling with a stone on the long end. Raise the counterweight, let gravity pull it down, and the long arm snaps upward, hurling the stone in a wide arc toward whatever unlucky structure or group of people is in the way. In reality, turning that simple idea into a reliable machine took a staggering amount of planning and labor. Start with the frame. It had to be enormous and tough enough to withstand repeated violent motion. Builders used huge timbers, carefully joined and braced with crossbeams, pegs, and iron straps. Every joint was a potential failure point. A cracked support or loose peg could twist the structure, wreck the timing of the throw, or cause a catastrophic collapse at the worst possible moment. The throwing arm itself was a masterpiece of balance. It had to be long, flexible enough not to shatter from sudden stress, and heavy enough to handle the counterweight. The pivot point sat closer to the counterweight end, so that the short side carried the heavy load, while the long side did most of the traveling. When the arm fired, the short end dropped a relatively small distance, while the long end swung through a huge arc. The counterweight was the real engine. Builders filled large wooden boxes with stones, earth, or lead, sometimes thousands of pounds in total. In some designs, the counterweight hung freely like a swinging box. In others, it was a more rigid block. Either way, when crews raised it up using winches and ropes, they were storing gravitational potential energy. Releasing that weight turned gravity into a wrecking ball with a college degree. At the far end of the arm, a sling held the projectile. This sling was essentially a tough, flexible cradle made of rope and fabric or leather. One end was fixed to the arm. The other slipped over a small metal peg near the tip of the beam. When the trebuchet fired, the sling trailed behind like the tail of a comet, then whipped forward and opened at just the right moment, letting the stone fly free. That release timing was not left to chance. The angle of the peg, the length of the sling, and the weight of the projectile all influenced when exactly the stone let go. Adjusting the peg slightly forward or backward changed the release angle, allowing crews to fine-tune range and trajectory. It was a form of medieval calibration. The machine looked brutal, but behind that brutality was a careful understanding of how to get a stone to land where you wanted it. Firing the trebuchet was a coordinated effort. Crews began by lowering the arm after a shot, usually by controlling ropes attached to the throwing end. Then teams of men, or sometimes animals, turned large winches or tread wheels to haul the counterweight back up. As the weight rose, the long arm dipped down till it rested in a loading position. While this was happening, other crew members prepared the next projectile. Stones had to be of an appropriate size and shape. Too small, and they did not carry enough impact. Too large, and they risked overloading the frame or sling. Some sieges saw workers shaping stones into rough spheres to improve aerodynamics and predictability. In desperate situations, attackers grabbed whatever they could, from chunks of demolished walls to broken statues. Once the counterweight was fully elevated and the arm was secured with a trigger mechanism, the crew loaded the stone into the sling, checked all ropes, and cleared the firing area. The order to release came next. Someone pulled the trigger rope, the locking bar dropped away, and gravity took over. Watching a trebuchet in motion must have been unforgettable. The counterweight plunged downward. The long arm swept upward in a smooth, accelerating arc. The sling snapped out behind, then whipped over. At just the right instant, the loose end slid off the metal peg. The stone left the sling and soared into the air, tracing a high arc that defenders on the walls could track with growing horror. When that projectile hit, the result depended on the target. Against stone walls, repeated impacts could chip and crack masonry, knock loose blocks, and gradually create a breach. Against towers, a well-placed shot could shear off upper sections or destabilize foundations. Against groups of people on open ground or in courtyards, the effects were immediate and gruesome, turning tight formations into bloody chaos. The soundscape around a working trebuchet was its own kind of psychological weapon. There was the creak and groan of ropes and wood as the counterweight was winched up. There was the heavy clunk of triggers engaging and disengaging. Then came the roaring rush of the arm as it fired, and the solid thud of stone hitting stone wood or earth in the distance. Defenders learned to recognize that sequence. Winch, creep, pause, release, impact. After a while, every new cycle felt like waiting for an incoming storm cloud to pick a random house. Range estimates varied with design, but large counterweight trebuchets could launch stones several hundred meters. That meant besieging forces could set up outside the effective range of most defensive missiles and still pound walls, towers, and inner courtyards. Some armies built platforms and reinforced ramps to give their machines height advantages, extending reach and angles of attack. The sheer size of these engines made them powerful symbols. Building one in view of the defending city sent a clear message. While carpenters raised the frame and workers assembled the armed defenders watched counting beams and measuring the growing silhouette against the sky. Even before the first stone flew, the machine was performing its psychological task. Commanders did not stop at plain rocks either. They understood that fear and disgust were weapons. Historical descriptions include lists of projectiles that go beyond simple masonry. Rotting animal carcasses, barrels of refuse, and other foul materials were hurled over walls to spread disease and foul the air. Severed heads and body parts of captured soldiers or envoys were sometimes launched as messages. Each impact said more than any letter ever could. In extreme cases, besiegers used victims of disease themselves as ammunition, turning the trebuchet into a crude instrument of biological terror. Whether the science behind these decisions was sound by modern standards or not, the psychological effect was undeniable. Defenders who saw infected bodies smashing into their streets had to wonder what invisible enemies they were now sharing space with. The presence of a trebuchet forced cities to adapt. Defensive builders began to think about sloped walls that might deflect incoming stones, deeper layers of earth and rubble behind outer shells, and angled towers that did not present flat faces to enemy shots. Some garrisons tried to mount counter-engines of their own, using smaller trebuchets or modified catapults to target enemy siege camps, supply lines, or even the siege engines themselves. Still, even with these countermeasures, the balance of power had shifted. Fortifications could no longer rely solely on thickness and height. The idea that a wall was simply unbreakable by anything short of mining or direct close attack had to be abandoned. Siege warfare stopped being a waiting game of hunger alone and became a contest of engineering. Trebuchets were not permanent fixtures. After a campaign, many were dismantled, their timbers reused for other projects. But the knowledge of how to build and operate them spread among engineers, master carpenters, and military leaders. Drawings, rules of thumb, and practical tricks were passed on, refined, and adapted to local needs. What stands out most about these machines is how they represent a particular kind of thinking. Take basic forces like gravity, combine them with clever mechanics, and you can turn simple stone into a weapon that destroys towers and terrifies a population. It is not just a story about big rocks and broken walls. It is a story about human creativity pointed in a very dark direction. Step back for a moment and imagine what it was like to stand in the middle of all this. Not in a painting, not in a movie, but for real. You are on a churned-up field where the ground is slick with mud-trampled grass and things you do not want to look at too closely. The air smells of sweat iron and smoke. You hear men shouting in 3 different dialects, horses screaming, armor rattling, and underneath all of it the blunt percussion of metal hitting metal and metal hitting bone. Every direction you turn, a different idea about killing is rushing past you. On one side, a line of infantry, long pole arms with hooked beaks and hammer faces. The heads of those weapons glint as they move together, a coordinated rhythm of stabbing and smashing. Each thrust is a small calculation. Aim for a gap, aim for a joint, aim for the thin line of flesh between plates. One successful hit turns an expensive suit of armor into a metal frame surrounding a collapsing body. On another side, you catch sight of a soldier swinging something that should never have been trusted to human hands. The chain of a flail whips overhead, the spiked ball trailing behind like a delayed thought. For a second, you are not even sure where that thing will land. It could wrap around a shield. It could slam into a helmet. It could come a little too close to the person using it. That one weapon carries its own little storm with it. Closer to the center, heavy fighters with broad shoulders are heaving warhammers in short, brutal arcs. When they connect, you hear a very specific noise, not sharp like a sword strike, but thick and final. It is the sound of energy going through steel into something soft and vital. You do not need to see the result to know someone is not getting back up. Mixed into the chaos, some soldiers carry simpler tools, rough wooden shafts topped with spikes or slightly shaped heads. These weapons do not look impressive from a distance. There are no intricate engravings. There is no polish. But in the crush of bodies, that simplicity becomes an advantage. They are easy to grip, quick to swing, and unforgiving when they land on skulls, knees, or ribs. If you look further back from the immediate melee, you see another layer of danger. Crews are clustered around wheeled frames and wooden towers. They are not shouting battle cries. They are counting. They are measuring. They are pulling on ropes and turning cranks. For them, the fight is about angles, tension, and timing. Every time a heavy bolt leaves a torsion engine or a stone arcs away from a long arm, a new pocket of terror appears somewhere else on the field or along a wall. From your perspective as a single fighter, all of these worlds overlap. You could be engaged in a desperate struggle with someone in front of you, trying to keep a spiked head away from your face, and then suddenly hear a crack above as a projectile slams into a nearby structure. A chunk of masonry might fall. Splinters might fly. Someone behind you might drop without warning, skewered from a direction that has nothing to do with the enemy in front of you. The medieval battlefield is not just a clash of weapons. It is a clash of design philosophies. Some weapons, like the Warhammer and Morning Star, are about direct energy transfer. The idea is simple. Hit hard, focus. The Force let physics finish the conversation. Those tools reward strength and timing. They turn the human body into a vulnerable shell that cracks under focused impact. Other weapons, like flails and certain polearms, lean into complexity and control. The user has to manage momentum, angles, and distance more carefully. The payoff is the ability to reach around shields, hook limbs, and exploit tiny openings that brute force might miss. Then there are the capture tools, the long poles topped with collars and hooks. They sit at a strange intersection of violence and economics. They treat the enemy not as an obstacle to crush, but as an asset to seize. The person on the other end of that pole is not just a threat. He is a walking purse, a promise of future coin, if you can drag him out of the fight alive. Behind it all stand the engineers of range people who embrace the idea that the safest way to win a fight is to kill from far away. They gave war machines long arms made of wood and rope turned gravity into a weapon and transformed empty sky into a highway for stones and darts. Their creations do not care who is brave or who has the best armor. They reward those who can calculate distance and keep a cool head while others panic. For the ordinary soldier, this mix of technologies creates an environment where there is no single correct way to behave. Some parts of the field reward aggression. Charge fast, swing, hard break the enemy line before fear gets a foothold. Other parts reward patience. Hug the ground when the big stones start flying, wait behind cover while the scorpion crews adjust their aim. Move only when the timing feels right. In that sense, medieval warfare is less like a chaotic mob and more like a layered machine, with each type of weapon occupying a role. Heavy breakers move to crush. Hooked and spiked tools pick apart individuals. Ranged engines strip away defenders and create openings. Restraint tools harvest the survivors who are too valuable to discard. It is easy to imagine this world as purely brutal, but there is also a strange kind of grim professionalism running through it. The person swinging a hammer has probably spent months learning how to move in armor without tripping, how to turn the hips and shoulders to add power, how to strike without overextending. The soldier managing a flail has practiced in quiet fields, getting hit by his own weapon enough times to finally understand its rhythm. The crew at the trebuchet has rehearsed the loading sequence until each step is automatic. Nobody on that field thinks in abstract terms like weapons system or combat doctrine. They think in very specific questions. How do I make this strike land before theirs? How do I stay out of the reach of that hook? How do I stand where the next stone from that machine is less likely to hit? The weapons bring design. The battlefield adds improvisation. Every new battle teaches a lesson. Armor works until a particular tool defeats it. A formation style dominates until someone discovers a way to break it with a new kind of blade or a better kind of pole. Each innovation leaves stories behind tales of a charge that failed, a wall that fell, or a noble taken alive by a device that seemed ridiculous until it closed around his neck. Over time, those stories begin to shape how people think about class skill and power. The tools carried by common soldiers start to erode the old assumption that noble birth guarantees superiority in battle. When a wool-clad militia fighter with a cheap but clever weapon can throw a wealthy knight into the mud, the social picture begins to blur. That slow shift driven by wood, iron, rope, and stone will eventually do more than just change tactics. It will begin to change how entire societies understand who really holds power when the fighting starts. Think about what it took to put all of these weapons into real human hands. None of them appeared out of thin air. Behind each hammer, flail, polearm, or siege engine stood a whole network of people who never set foot on the battlefield, but whose work shaped everything that happened there. If you follow the trail backward from a crushed helmet or a broken wall, you eventually end up in a workshop that smells of charcoal, hot iron, sawdust, and sweat. Start with the weaponsmith. This person is not just a metal worker. They are a kind of problem solver who understands both physics and human behavior without ever using those words. A knight shows up and complains that enemy armor has become thicker. The smith hears this and starts thinking about ways to concentrate force into smaller contact points. That thought eventually becomes a warhammer head with a refined striking face or a narrower spike. Or an infantry captain walks in with stories about cavalry charges smashing through unprepared lines. The smith does not need a battlefield map. They picture the impact in their head and imagine what it would take to stop a galloping horse. That line of thinking produces heavier shafts, reinforced spikes, and heads designed to survive the shock of sudden collision. These craftspeople learn from every failure. A hammerhead that cracks under repeated impact teaches them about impurities in the iron. A polearm socket that twists loose during a fight shows them where to strengthen the join between metal and wood. News that a certain design snapped at the worst possible moment spreads quickly through a region. The next batch they make comes out different. Forge work is only one side of the story. On another bench, a carpenter is shaping shafts from long pieces of hardwood. They pay attention to the grain following its natural lines, so the finished piece bends slightly under stress instead of shattering. They taper certain sections, thicken others, and smooth everything carefully, so the weapon sits correctly in the hand. In towns where militias are strong, this kind of work becomes a shared project. One street supplies shafts. Another specializes in metal heads. Someone else produces rivet straps or leather bindings. When conflict feels close, the pace picks up. Workshops echo late into the night. Sparks from forges paint the streets with orange flicker. None of this is romantic from the inside. It is exhausting labor. Standing in front of a hot fire for hours, pumping bellows, lifting heavy billets, and hammering them into shape wears out joints and lungs. Good iron is expensive. Charcoal needs to be burned in large quantities. Every broken tool represents lost time and money. Yet there is also pride. A smith might never ride into battle, but they hear the stories that come back. A captain returns from a campaign and says that the new beaked polearms held the line against armored horsemen. A common soldier insists that the slightly curved hammer face made the difference during a close fight. Those reports become part of the shop's reputation. Weapons are not just objects. They are calling cards. Certain regions become famous for particular designs. One town is known for producing brutal, reliable maces. Another gains prestige for long, straight spears with durable heads. City militias brag about where their gear comes from. Knights pay extra to have armor and weapons made in specific centers with well-known styles. This reputation has real consequences. A merchant arriving in a foreign market with a cart full of tools and weapons might see customers flock to a particular rack because they recognize the pattern on the metal or the shape of the socket. That visual language of design spreads quietly across borders. Meanwhile, on training grounds, far from the forge's instructors are turning those tools into extensions of human bodies. A recruit handed a warhammer for the first time does not automatically know how to move with it. They start by learning simple things: how to grip so the wrist is supported, how to turn the hips into the swing, how to recover after a strike without leaving the torso exposed. The instructor walks among them, adjusting shoulders, correcting foot placement, shaping raw effort into something that can actually survive combat. Training with a flail looks different. Before a student is allowed anywhere near actual spikes, they may work with a padded practice version. The first lessons are about self-preservation. The weapon has to be kept moving on a safe path. The user learns to read the delay in the chain and feel where the head will be half a second later. Only after countless repetitions does the practice tool become a real one. Polearm schools develop their own choreography. Students stand in long rows each with a shaft in their hands. At a shouted signal, every beak and hammerhead comes down in unison. hits a practice target, then withdraws and moves into a guard position. The instructor watches for lazy grips, uneven timing, or weapons held too high or too low. Mistakes get corrected quickly because, out on real fields, those errors mean an open gap in a line that a charging opponent can exploit. The siege crews train in quieter spaces, often behind city walls or in open fields. They practice raising and lowering counterweights, aligning wooden arms, and managing ropes under tension. They test loading procedures again and again, solving small problems before they become catastrophic. A misfired trebuchet is not just embarrassing. It can kill its own crew. Precision and discipline become habits. For all of these groups, repetition turns fear into familiarity. The first time someone hears a morning star slam into armor up close, they may flinch. After enough drills and real engagements, that sound becomes information instead of shock. It says that a specific weapon type is in use nearby. It says that someone on a particular side of the field has chosen close-range brutality as their method. As technology spreads, social identities form around specific tools. Some mercenary bands become known for their giant two-handed swords. Their members develop a distinct style, clothing, and swagger that reflect the weapon they carry. Other groups take pride in their expertise with long-beaked polearms or specific siege engines. Badges, flags, and nicknames grow out of these specializations. Even in civilian life, that association lingers. A veteran putting his weapon over the hearth is not just storing a tool. He is pinning a symbol of who he was and what he did to the wall of his home. The shape of that iron or steel says something about the kind of work he did with his body in earlier years. On the other side of the equation, non-combatants live under the shadow of these designs. A farmer working near a border might recognize the distant silhouette of a counterweight engine going up and know that it is time to pack valuables and leave. A townsperson might see militia members drilling with new weapons and understand without a word being spoken that tensions are rising and the city is preparing for something serious. Over time, ordinary people learn to read the outlines of different weapons almost as a second language. A hooked head on a long shaft means threats to cavalry. A simple spike on a shorter staff suggests militia organization. A cluster of machines on wheels beyond the fields hints that someone has invested in long-range destruction. None of these shapes are neutral. Each one carries stories, fears, and rumors attached to it. What all of this reveals is that medieval weaponry is not just about momentary violence. It is about the constant movement of knowledge, from battlefield to workshop, from workshop to training ground, and from training ground back to the battlefield. Each cycle refines something. A spike is sharpened differently. A shaft is wrapped with extra iron. A sling rope is replaced with a tougher fiber. A firing sequence is tweaked for speed. Those adjustments may look tiny up close. In the long run, they shift the balance between life and death for thousands of people. These weapons did more than just change how people fought. They quietly shifted who had a say in violence at all. For a long time, power on the battlefield matched power in society. If you had money, you bought armor horses and elite training. That turned you into a mounted knight and gave you a role at the top of the military food chain. Everyone else filled in around you as support. Spears, stones, and farm tools against steel and muscle memory stacked from childhood. Then cheap, clever tools started cutting into that advantage. A spiked club in the hands of a town militia fighter could drop a noble from his horse. A hook-tipped polearm could pull a heavily armored rider off balance and turn him into a target. A line of disciplined infantry with specialized weapons could stop a cavalry charge that would have terrified earlier generations. The battlefield began to look less like a stage reserved for aristocrats and more like a violent debate where commoners had a louder voice. The ransom economy also began to twist expectations. If a captured knight could bring in more money alive than dead, then the person who snagged him with a collar on a stick or pinned him under a mass of polearms suddenly had leverage. That leverage did not come from a title granted at birth. It came from training opportunity and the right equipment. Captors could bargain, demand shares, argue for their cut. Money that once flowed almost entirely between nobles now leaked into the pockets of ordinary soldiers and mercenaries. That flow of reward helped fuel a professional class of fighters. Mercenary companies grew around specific skills. Some groups marketed themselves as experts in pike warfare, promising to hold ground against cavalry. Others advertised precision with siege engines or famous skill with giant swords. These companies negotiated contracts, set terms, and moved from employer to employer. Their loyalty followed coin rather than bloodline. Weapons in their hands became not just tools but brands. A ruler who hired a company known for brutal hammerwork or disciplined polearm formations was sending a message to opponents and subjects alike. The silhouette of those weapons marching down a road said that someone with money had decided to invest in a particular style of violence. That choice shaped how rebels, rival nobles, or border enemies responded. Meanwhile, in towns and cities, the rising importance of organized infantry sharpened the role of urban militias. Guilds trained members to fight together. Local leaders pushed for better equipment. When conflict arrived, cities could field blocks of armored foot soldiers carrying serious weapons, not just hastily armed peasants with improvised sticks. That gave city councils more bargaining power with kings and dukes. If a ruler wanted their support, he had to negotiate instead of simply expecting obedience. Weapon design and politics began to intertwine. A polearm that could stop cavalry did not just threaten enemy knights. It also limited the ability of a local lord to intimidate his own population by riding them down with a handful of loyal retainers. A siege engine that could batter down walls from a distance forced rulers to think very carefully about who controlled that kind of technology inside their borders. Some authorities tried to regulate production. Certain blade lengths were restricted. Some regions issued rules about which social classes could carry specific types of swords in public. Cities passed ordinances about where forges could operate and who was allowed to manufacture large engines. The logic was clear. If you cannot stop new weapons from existing, you can at least try to control who gets to own them. Of course, control was never perfect. Smaller tools slipped through restrictions. A flail made from parts of a grain threshing tool did not announce itself as a piece of regulated equipment. A heavy club with a metal cap could be passed off as a simple walking stick until the moment it met someone's skull. The line between civilian object and weapon blurred in ways that authorities found difficult to manage. Peasant uprisings and urban revolts fed on this ambiguity. When people decided they had been pushed too far, they did not need full armories to make their point. They needed farm tools that could be modified militia gear, that could be stolen or repurposed, and a few experienced veterans to show them how to hold a formation. Clever use of polearms, flails, and blunt weapons transformed angry crowds into something more organized and dangerous. At the same time, the spectacle of specialized weapons still reinforced elite status in other settings. Ceremonial halls displayed ornate examples of giant swords, engraved maces, and gilded polearms. Guards at entrances carried polished versions of practical weapons turned into symbols. These pieces were not meant to be used in back alley brawls. They were reminders, carved in steel, of who theoretically controlled legitimate force. That word, legitimate, is important. Violence itself was everywhere. Bandits, feuds, and local disputes spilled blood on a regular basis. What changed with the spread of effective weapons among common soldiers and militias was the argument about who had the right to organize violence at scale. If a town could field disciplined infantry, it could bargain harder with its lord. If a king could afford professional engine crews and mercenary companies, he could pressure rebellious nobles. Every new design that made killing more efficient also made these negotiations more tense. In the background, there was another shift, more subtle, but just as powerful. The presence of advanced weapons made people think differently about risk and safety. A noble riding into a fight in earlier centuries might expect that personal bravery and skill would carry significant weight. In a later period, that same noble knew that he might be yanked from the saddle by a hook, crushed by a hammer, or skewered by a long-range bolt before he even closed with the enemy he had hoped to duel. That realization changed behavior. Some elites began delegating more of the most dangerous tasks to professionals. They rode in protected positions, let mercenary pikemen and gunners take the brunt of first contact, and kept their own lives for the business of ruling and negotiating. Others doubled down on personal martial identity training, harder seeking better armor, looking for ways to stand out despite the rising tide of organized common soldiers. In both cases, weapons design sat quietly at the center of the story. A curved spike on a pole might not look like a political statement, but the moment it made a nobleman's armor irrelevant, it became one. A catapult or trebuchet might seem like a pile of wood and rope until it made a city surrender months earlier than expected. Every innovation shifted some balance between rider and foot soldier, between noble and commoner, between ruler and town council. One of the most important lessons is that complexity did not always win. Make a weapon too complicated or too hard to learn, and its use narrowed to a small group of experts. Make it just clever enough, and it spread into the hands of many. The designs that truly reshaped medieval power relations were not always the most spectacular. Sometimes they were the ugly practical ones that anyone with a bit of training and courage could use effectively. That balance between accessibility and lethality created a kind of invisible contest that ran under the surface of medieval life. Weapon makers, rulers, and ordinary fighters all participated in it, whether they thought about it directly or not. Try to imagine sitting in a medieval tavern at night, long after the fighting is done. There is a fire in the hearth, cheap wine on the table, and a mixed crowd pressed shoulder to shoulder. Veterans with scars, young recruits who have not seen combat yet, merchants, and the occasional priest trying to keep people out of trouble. The stories that circle the room say a lot about how people really felt about these weapons. One man might slam his mug down and talk about the first time he saw a warhammer hit a helmet at close range. He does not describe tactics. He talks about the sound, that thick crunch that cut through the general noise all around. Even years later, that detail sticks in his mind. Another man jumps in with a story about a morning star that dented a breastplate so hard it left the shape of the spikes pressed into the metal like a signature. These are not technical lectures. They are memories of sensation, the weight of iron in the hand, the sting in the shoulders after swinging for too long, the way blood looks on polished steel versus on rough wood, how the air feels different when a trebuchet stone passes overhead, a sudden rush, a momentary shadow, Then the distant crash. People can pretend that war is about banners and honor, but these memories always pull the conversation back to the small physical things. Chroniclers and writers, on the other hand, often walk a strange line between admiration and horror. Some of them praise certain weapons as signs of progress or divine favor. A city that holds out thanks to strong walls and effective engines might claim that God clearly approved of their defensive technology. An army that breaks a noble enemy with disciplined infantry and clever polearms might see that victory is proof that their cause is righteous. Other writers lean into moral judgment. They see spiked heads and chained weapons as symbols of human cruelty. They compare them to instruments of torture. Some sermons rail against the creative energy spent on making new ways to hurt people. Preachers stand in pulpits and describe in vivid detail skulls smashed by iron and limbs torn by stones, then demand to know what kind of world invests so much skill in that particular craft. The church did not speak with one voice on this. On one hand, there were calls for restraint, for limitations on how wars should be fought. On the other, religious authorities sometimes blessed weapons before battle, sanctified banners, and declared certain conflicts holy. A mace with a cross engraved on its head could be both a tool of spiritual symbolism and a very effective way to rearrange someone's bones. Some weapons picked up rumors of being cursed or blessed based on the fates of their users. A flail that killed several of its owners in training might be whispered about as unlucky. Nobody wanted to be the next person assigned to carry it. A particular sword that survived multiple battles and duels without breaking gained a reputation as a faithful companion. Men would swear the blade had its own will, that it turned in their hand at just the right moment. That habit of giving weapons personalities shows up everywhere. People named their swords their favorite hammers, sometimes even siege engines. A trebuchet that repeatedly knocked chunks out of a stubborn tower might earn a nickname and its own crude decorations. Crews carved small symbols into the wood, tied tokens to the frame, or painted little faces on the counterweight box, as if the machine were a teammate, not just a pile of lumber. At the same time, the law tried to keep up with this growing variety of tools. Authorities in some regions grew nervous about certain designs, especially ones that felt sneaky or excessively cruel. There were complaints about weapons that caused lingering, untreatable injury or that seemed to go beyond the already harsh standards of the time. Some city statutes attempted to ban civilian carrying of particularly brutal items within walls, especially during festivals when too much wine and too many blades could turn celebrations into disasters. Tournaments and formal duels responded in their own way. Noble combat in controlled settings often favored cleaner weapons. Swords, lances, and blunted training tools appeared more often than flails or spiked clubs. The goal was still to show courage and skill, but ideally without turning the field into a reenactment of the messiest parts of real battle. Even so, accidents happened. A shattered lance could drive splinters into a chest. A poorly controlled sword stroke could still kill, even if its edge was dulled. To spectators, these events were entertainment and political theater, not just practice. Seeing a knight handle his sword with precision reassured his followers that he was capable. Watching him ride well and control his horse suggested he could lead in war. The fact that the weapons used were often cleaner than those on real battlefields did not change that impression. In the public eye, the elegant tools still stood for martial value, while the rougher gear stayed associated with serious campaigns and ugly work. Behind closed doors, though rulers and their advisors knew very well which weapons really decided wars. Reports from campaigns went into detail about how walls fell, which formations held, and which did not. Those documents did not dwell on chivalry. They talked about whether the new batch of polearms performed as promised or whether the latest siege engines lived up to their cost. Decisions about future investment rested on those discussions. That practical view set the stage for the next big shift that was beginning to appear in the later medieval period. Black powder technology crept into the picture at first in crude, unreliable forms. Small hand cannons, noisy bombards, and odd, experimental devices appeared on fields and at sieges. These early firearms were clumsy and slow compared to later designs, but they introduced a new principle. A ball of lead or iron, driven by explosive force, could punch through armor that no hammerbeak or spike could reliably defeat at range. For a while, older and newer systems lived side by side. Engineers who had grown up building trebuchets now found themselves experimenting with cast metal barrels. Infantry veterans who trusted their pikes and polearms watched nervously as gunners learned to handle hot, dangerous substances that could explode if mishandled. The noise, smoke, and flash of gunpowder weapons added a fresh layer of sensory overload to battlefields that were already chaotic. Early firearms did not immediately replace traditional weapons. They misfired, often took time to reload, and sometimes harmed the user if poorly made. A skilled archer or crossbowman could still provide faster, more dependable fire under many conditions. Yet the seed was planted. The ability to deliver armor-piercing force at a distance without needing precise muscle training appealed to rulers who wanted power less tied to an elite warrior class. For the craftsmen and soldiers who had dedicated their lives to perfecting the older tools, this change must have felt strange. A smith who had spent decades refining the curve of a beak or the balance of a hammerhead now saw nobles turning their attention toward barrels and shot. A veteran who prided himself on his skill with polearms had to watch inexperienced gunners doing serious damage despite having a fraction of his training time. Even as this new technology spread, though, the legacy of medieval weapons remained deeply embedded in culture. Stories, songs, and sagas carried forward images of hammers, denting helmets, flails, whipping through the air, and monstrous stones smashing against tall walls. People remembered the feel of those tools, even when new ones arrived. They remembered the bruises from training the weight of the metal at the end of a long march, and the sound of their own heartbeats inside a helmet as a formation advanced. The old weapons also continued to matter in places where gunpowder was scarce or unreliable. Remote regions, small skirmishes, bandit raids, and sudden village uprisings still relied on steel wood and muscle. A club with a spike remained cheaper than a firearm. A pole with a sharp head remained easier to maintain than a barrel that needed careful casting and measured powder. So for a long time, the medieval toolkit and the early gunpowder world blended, each shaping the other. In that overlap, the meaning of all those earlier designs became easier to see. They represented centuries of trial and error, countless lives spent testing and refining ideas in the harshest laboratory possible. They showed what human creativity can do when it is given a single grim assignment: improve the efficiency of violence. That assignment did not disappear with the arrival of gunpowder. It just moved into a new medium. Walk into a good museum and stand in front of a rack of medieval weapons for a while. Behind the glass are war hammers, with worn faces, flails with stiffened chains, polearms with hooked heads, and enormous swords that look almost theatrical. Kids press their noses to the glass and whisper to each other. Adults point, take photos, and make small jokes to soften the unease. The metal does not move. It does not shine the way it did in sunlight on a field. It just sits there in the quiet, letting your imagination do the work. Most people feel two things at once in that room. On one side, there is fascination. These objects are impressive. The craftsmanship, the balance, the way each detail seems deliberate. Even someone who has never held a weapon can sense that a lot of thought went into getting the shape just right. On the other side, there is a faint chill. Because once you understand how these things worked, it is hard not to picture them in motion, cutting through air, slamming into armor, or falling in an arc from a castle wall. The same curves and edges that make them interesting as objects also remind you that they were designed to meet soft bodies with maximum effect. Modern culture keeps returning to this tension. Movies and games love the visual drama of medieval weapons. A giant sword slung over a character's back, a spiked club resting casually on someone's shoulder, a row of tall polearms framing a throne room. These images have become shorthand for toughness, danger, and romanticized battle. The grittier the setting, the more likely someone on screen is going to be holding something that looks like it could have come from a 14th century battlefield. At the same time, documentaries, books, and experiments pick apart the myths. People test replica weapons on armor and ballistic gel. They run slow-motion footage of flails, striking shields, or warhammers, denting helmets. They discuss pressure per square inch, energy transfer, and material fatigue. That analytical approach strips away some of the legend and replaces it with a catalog of very practical observations. The interplay between those two views says a lot about how modern audiences relate to violence. On one level, there is a safe distance. Watching an actor swing a sword on a screen or pressing a button to make a virtual trebuchet fire feels abstract. The weight, smell, and sound of the real thing are missing. You can enjoy the shape without feeling the consequences. On another level, there is a recognition that these tools are part of the story of how societies develop. They influenced who could rule, who could rebel, how cities grew, and how wars ended. The rise of disciplined infantry with effective weapons reshaped politics and class structures. Siege engines determined which fortifications survived long enough to matter. Long-handled capture tools and ransom culture altered the flow of wealth. These tools were not just side notes. They were active forces in history. Thinking about them carefully also reveals something deeper and less comfortable. The same intelligence that builds cathedrals, bridges, and watermills also builds flails, morning stars, and trebuchets. The same ability to imagine new shapes and connections can be turned towards solving problems of comfort or towards solving problems of killing. A curved beak on a polearm is not fundamentally different as an idea from a clever gear system in a clock. Both are about applying force in a controlled way. That realization makes the weapons hard to dismiss as relics from a more brutal age that has nothing to do with the present. Modern technology has moved on from iron spikes and wooden frames, but the pattern remains. A problem appears on the battlefield or in a conflict, and designers look for ways to answer it. Sometimes the answers are simple and low cost. Sometimes they're complex and expensive. The goals still revolve around reach, power, control, and efficiency. There is something else worth noticing when you stand in front of that museum glass. Most of the weapons show signs of use, or at least of handling. Grips are worn smooth in particular spots. Edges and spikes have small chips or rounded tips from contact with hard surfaces. Protective straps and bindings carry marks where fingers have tightened and sweat has soaked in. Even sieves of wood from engines that no longer exist bear holes and scratches from assembly and disassembly. Those marks are the only direct physical link to the many hands that wielded and maintained these things. The individual names are mostly gone. The stories of specific blows, near misses, and moments of fear are lost. What remains are curves, angles, and damage patterns. Each one is a kind of fossil record of human movement. Imagining those movements in detail changes how these tools feel. A warhammer stops being an abstract symbol of brutality and becomes the midpoint of a chain that includes a smith at a fire, a training ground, a line of running soldiers, and a single instant of impact that decided whether one particular person lived or died. A flail stops being a dramatic prop and turns into a memory of someone standing alone in a field, trying to learn how not to hit themselves while they practice. What emerges from that picture is not a simple message about whether these weapons are good or bad. Instead, it is a reminder that technology, even at its most frightening, cites inside stories of effort, fear, ambition, and survival. People did not invent warhammers because they liked cruelty for its own sake. They invented them because they were afraid of dying inside armor that had stopped being effective. People built trebuchets because they were tired of sitting outside stone walls for months, hoping hunger would do the job. That does not excuse the suffering those tools caused, but it explains part of the drive behind them. The uncomfortable question is what to do with that understanding now. One option is to treat medieval weapons purely as historical curiosities. Study them, classify them, maybe recreate them for controlled demonstrations, and then put them back behind glass. Another option is to use them as a mirror. Look at the creativity that went into their design and ask where that same kind of thinking is being applied today. Every time a new technology appears that promises faster, more efficient control over others, you can see a faint echo of a smith somewhere in the past holding up a new weapon head and saying, "This will solve your problem." The problem changes. The tools look different. The underlying offer stays surprisingly similar. The value in tracing these old shapes is that they make the pattern easier to see. A spike on a club teaches you about focusing force. A beak on a pole teaches you about exploiting weak points. A flail teaches you about trading predictability for chaos. A trebuchet teaches you about turning natural forces into weaponized motion. Once you recognize those patterns in metal and wood, you are better prepared to recognize them in other, more modern materials. In that sense, understanding medieval weapons is not just about learning how people once fought. It is also about learning how people think when they are under pressure, afraid, and determined to gain an edge. That kind of thinking can build defenses, medical tools, and systems that keep people safe. It can also build instruments that make it easier to harm and control. Standing in front of that museum glass or watching a careful reconstruction in a video, you have the advantage that none of the original users did. You can see the entire arc at once, not just the moment of impact, but the long line of invention, adaptation, and consequence that surrounded each design. You can choose what lessons to take from that. You can simply admire the craftsmanship, or you can let the details push you to ask harder questions about how ingenuity is used in the present. The metal in those displays is quiet now. The chains do not rattle. The The spikes do not shine with anything except reflected light. The long arms of invisible trebuchets are still. Yet the shapes remain powerful. They carry forward the memory of a time when every curve and edge was drawn with one intention in mind. Understanding that intention clearly is one way to make sure that whenever new tools appear in any age, you notice early what they are really built to do.